Hi, I'm John, and this is my video about REST APIs. So today I'm going to be talking about REST APIs. We're going to take a look at what are REST APIs, methods, and the components that make up an API call. So REST stands for Representation State Transfer. It uses standard HTTP codes, status codes, URIs, and MIME types. So if you're familiar with standard HTTP when used by a user via a web browser, making calls to websites uses standard methods, the same as a REST API would. So if you go into the developer tools of a browser, for example, and you connect to a website, you can see what status codes are being responded with. You can see what methods are being called. And a REST API based on HTTP works in the same way. They're designed to be simple. So since they're following HTTP standards, this makes them simple for developers because HTTP standards are typically broadly known by developers. Because of the stateless nature, they're also scalable. There's no need to maintain a session. There's the API's cache responses, which makes them performant, and they're interoperable. This means they can work between different programming languages. It doesn't matter what the programming language is of the server or the application that's providing the API, and it doesn't matter what code or programming language or framework is being used by the client that is calling the API. This is ultimately a agnostic way of transferring information over HTTP. So when we look at the specifics of an API call, one of the key components of any API call is a method that's being used, and we have a number of them. The 5 typical methods used are get, post, put, patch, and delete. Get is probably one of the most common, and this is the one that's used when browsing the web in a web browser. When we're fetching data from the website or web API, we're using the get method. Post is when we send data, so in the context of a browser, this would be submitting a form typically. The same with an API, we use a post method to send data to the server. We've then got put, which is updating an entire resource. So if we're making a put API call, in the body of the API call, we've typically got all of the fields that make up that resource or that object or item that we're updating. And then we've got patch, which is similar, however, we only need to contain certain properties. So whereas with a put call, we would have everything from ID to the name, the description, for example. With patch, we could say we only want to update the description, so we only need to contain the ID probably and the new description in the body of the request. And finally, we've got delete. So if we want to delete an object or resource, we typically use the delete method also. Now, whilst these are standard methods, APIs are custom built by the developers that develop it for a certain application, so they can vary. We might have, for example, if the developers have done it this way, we might delete objects via a post request by setting certain parameters or certain properties in the body of the request. So in summary, these are standard methods, but how they're actually working in the application that you're using may vary. So then we'll just take a look at the components to make up an API request. So the first one and the most important one is the endpoint that we're using. This is typically the URL to begin with, and then possibly a path after that. This path can go deeper and deeper in different scenarios. But the example we've got here is api.example.com/users, which may be where you would do API requests relating to users in an application. We then got the method, as discussed in the previous slide. We specify this for the API call. We've got the body, which contains the actual data. So if we take the example of we've got a book management application, we want to create a book, then we would do a post request, and in the body we might have all of the attributes, the genre, the description, the name of the book in the body of the request. Next we've got parameters. So parameters are set in the URL. They come after the URL path and the path of the API call. In this example, we've got api.example.com/users, age is equal to 25. So there's a key pair value. The key is age, the value is 25. So this might be used to retrieve all users that are age 25, for example. Finally, we've got headers. So first of all, we've got general headers. These are present in the request and the response. They don't directly define the body. Some examples are cache control and date. Then we've got request. This is more information about the resource that's being fetched and the client. So if you're using Postman, for example, which is an application you can use to make API calls manually without needing code, you typically use to test APIs. You'll see in Postman that it sets a default value for user agent that reflects that it's a Postman agent. You can, if you're developing the API, you can decide to capture this information and maybe log it so that it can be analysed and you have a record of a typical client that's being used for the application. We've then got entity. This is concerned with the body, so things like content length and content type. If you dealt with API calls before, you'll probably recognise content type. We might specify this to application JSON. That's the most common type of body that we'd use, but we might use something different, and this is a parameter that we would set for that. Sorry, a header that we would set for that. We've then got custom. So as a developer of the API, you can set various other headers that you wish to set and add to the application. This would then go into the documentation for your API. So these can be with any name that you want. Some examples here are X API key and authorization. That is all. Thanks for watching.